Hello all. Today we're discussing imaginaries, in particular Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor's modern social imaginaries, which we can take as systems of meaning with a particular impact upon our current post-Enlightenment society. Keywords today will be social imaginary and public sphere. So, quick biography: Charles Taylor, interesting guy, Canadian, 88 years of age, studied at Oxford and McGill University, later worked at both, and also served as a professor of law and philosophy at Northwestern. Won the Berggruen Prize in 2016, where he picked up a cool $1 million for his contributions to the progress of humanity. Works a lot in the hermeneutic tradition of Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Gadamer, giants in the field of 20th century philosophy, and also shared a major prize with Jürgen Habermas, a thinker we'll delve into more later, but who's mentioned today as well, as his ideas inform Taylor's thoughts on the public sphere. Recently published another work titled Reconstructing Democracy. In short, heavy hitter. To begin, let's look at Charles Taylor's definition of modernity. That historically unprecedented amalgam of new practices and institutional forms, science, technology, industrial production, urbanization, of new ways of living, individualism, secularization, instrumental rationality, and of new forms of malaise, alienation, meaninglessness, a sense of impending social dissolution. Taylor writes, "I am thinking rather of the ways in which people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations." So yeah, why are we learning this, you ask? Well, because we've talked about ancient rhetoric, and we've talked about contemporary forms of rhetoric, but we haven't really talked about modern rhetoric. So when I say modern, I don't mean iPhones and the internet. I mean the post-Enlightenment era philosophers like Kant or Rousseau or Adam Smith or John Locke. That gives us a whole slew of influential thinkers of many different types. But that had to have happened, or else we may perhaps have been stuck in a feudal society. Forget about the technology. It's about the thoughts, and how we structure our thoughts to engage with societal positions and societal challenges, expectations, inequalities, and conundrums. Question 1. According to Taylor, what is peculiar about our modern concept of order? With regard to modernity, imagine your day-to-day existence and the arguments you face, and what kind of rhetorical field you see in front of you when you go to make your case for your own defense. You're not just engaging in a system of exigencies and constraints so as to appeal to an audience. You're engaging with an entire social system of great complexity and great variability. But that's all getting a bit highfalutin, right? A bit fancy person explains important idea. How about this instead? After this lecture is posted, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to office hours so we can ask questions. Then I'm going to go pet my cat, do some physical therapy to deal with an injury, and take a 5 to 6 mile hike with a mask and filtered water after making a meal out of some organic eggs and spinach. I'll listen to a podcast I subscribe to, and I'll drive the speed limit. If somebody gets too close to me, I'll walk away from them because social distancing, and I'll hope I won't get a ticket for parking where I shouldn't park but where I park anyway. Then I'll come home, grade discussion posts, and make sure the latest lecture gets up. And that's engaging with the modern social imaginary. Why? Well, I'm talking about my own actions as far as they involve the public sphere of interactions, my private preferences for food and boring guy exercise, and my willingness to subject myself to modern laws like the speed limit as well as to skirt them, like with parking. You also see there's an economic element there. The fancy organic eggs that I can't afford, but they're great, so I buy them. And it becomes a question of political economy, as well as self-governance. I'm taking care of myself so I can take care of others, like the cat that suckered me into caring for her. This all involves a confluence of relationships and a bunch of connections between the public, the private, the civic, and the economic, as well as the political. Look at what's happening as you go about your day. And realize that's just you and yourself and your particular circumstances. All people, however, engage with societal frameworks, laws, and customs wherein there are rules, expectations, and consequences, be they personal, professional, or legal. All of them require us to conduct ourselves in certain ways, and they're often different depending on the situation. And all of our daily lives, even if they're fairly similar, will be different too. And that's why it's not imaginary, but imaginaries. There's a bunch of them. Taylor is writing specifically about Western modernity here, and describes the social imaginary as a, quote, common understanding that makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy, which comes up on page 23. There are three things which act as a foundation here: a modern moral order, as you can see on page 92, the social imaginary, and the public sphere. The public sphere is a huge deal. It comes up a lot in sociology, geography, etc., and we're going to talk more about it, but the thing to learn here is how Taylor foregrounds its importance. With regard to the moral order, Taylor writes, "The underlying idea of moral order stresses the rights and obligations that individuals have in regard to one another, even prior to or outside of the political bond. This moral order has changed over time, because history will history, but it remains crucial to Taylor's concept." So why is modernity modernity? Because of its focus on the hallmarks of the social order we spend so much time debating about today. We're not concerned about the monarchy and peasantry. We're concerned about things like democracy, capitalism, human rights, public education, etc. We're also concerned with the quote, "we" of it. How we engage others. This isn't just all holding hands and getting along, though. Obviously, there's a lot of conflict and argument and disagreement involved. And Taylor is talking about the backdrop that makes such argument possible. Look at how the news is lately. It's actually a lot of people saying, no, I have an issue with this modern social imaginary as it affects my life. Taylor's talking about collectivity. He's talking about moral order, and he's talking about the role of public dialectics. And yes, there's a throwback to Plato there. And these all take place in the public sphere, as it contributes to social processes which are common in our multiple modernities. And on that note, he really dislikes theory, which leads me to our second question. Question 2. How is a social imaginary not a theory? Taylor writes, "Humans operated with a social imaginary well before they ever got into the business of theorizing about themselves." I want to note that, like Toulmin, Taylor points out the role of anatomy as a key to understand his thought structure. Phenomenologists take note. But he also points out how the actual and the ideal in pre-modern society was not a thing. Hierarchy had a ton of weight. And you can see this on page 9 of the PDF or page 98 of the article. But of course, we're not necessarily seeing all this because we're in it. This is our existence. The things we're surrounded by, what's happening to us in the modern social imaginary, how could we be outside of it? Here's a revealing quote. "This history is easy to forget because once we are all well installed in the modern social imaginary, it seems the only possible one, the only one that makes sense. After all, are we not all individuals? Do we not associate in society for our mutual benefit? How else to measure social life?" Alright, now what does this have to do with rhetoric? Well, I can explain it, but I think it's important for you to voice your thoughts. Question 3. How can you relate modern social imaginaries to rhetoric and rhetorical studies? How do you think it would be useful? For Taylor, quote, "Modernity is also the rise of new principles of sociality." And there's a great breakdown of moral order on page 100, or page 11 of the PDF, that summarizes his thoughts. Taylor also brings up religion in this, especially on page 103, noting a flat hierarchy between types of believers and how they lead their lives, and describing them as equally hallowed. Ordinary life is thus sanctified. He then links this to the economic, which you see on page 105. Quote, "And so perhaps the first big shift, both in theory and in social imaginary, consists in our coming to see society as an economy, an interlocking set of activities of production, exchange, and consumption, which form a system with its own laws and dynamic. There are other moves at work here as well. For instance, Taylor talks about having an inherent grasp, a natural grasp, of what to do in what space, with regard to roles, positions, movement, etc. This is pre-theoretical for him. And there's another really cool quote here about taking part in modern democracy. "We are participating in the narrative of our becoming, whereby we recognize this capacity to demonstrate peacefully as an achievement of democracy, hard won by our ancestors, or as a capability to which we aspire through this common action." Think about things happening right now and how applicable that is. Social imaginaries change over time. Taylor is all about tracing these changes. He tracks them through the economy, the public sphere, and the practices and approaches of democratic self-governance. Now what about the public sphere? Building off German social theorist Jürgen Habermas's definition, Taylor defines it as, quote, "The term public sphere refers to a common space in which the members of society meet through a variety of media, print and electronic as well as face-to-face encounters, wherein they discuss matters of common interest and thus are able to form a common mind about these." The kicker is, of course, is that he uses it to acknowledge multiple spaces. It builds what he calls a metatopical common space. Taylor links this into a different form of secular space, where common actions and common minds may exist. Okay, being real, this is one of the toughest readings we're going to do, but if you look over the review of it and then go back to it, it's actually a really interesting piece and it's pretty well written, and it traces an interesting historical shift. It's important to grasp those kinds of shifts. But why is it of interest to us? Well, because we engage in publics, and we engage in publics by way of particular imaginaries with particular histories, many of which are variable, but linked by way of time, space, beliefs, politics, traditions, etc. However, they're often different for many of us on an individual level, because it can be useful for grounding arguments and articulating them to the questions at hand. In short, it's another thing to survey as we look over the available means of persuasion. After all of this, people are transformed into a state of new collective agency. According to Taylor, quote, "The way we imagine our social life is articulated in these forms. The society in which we live is not just a politically structured order, we also belong to civil society. We are linked in an economy, can seek access to a public sphere, and move in a world of independent associations. This has not only political but historical ramifications, and they are certainly important ones. But being aware of it means being able to see it and critique it. We are presented as historical agents. We go forth and challenge the big ideas and the big issues of life and our existence in our own little ways, every single day." And with that said, I hope you have a good day, and I hope you challenge something. Catch you online.